he didn't tell you what I really taught. And those of you who don't know, I taught Greek and Hebrew for almost 40 years. So you have to put up with some things. Last time I was in this pulpit, I talked a lot about elephants and what color they were. And the only reason I mentioned it is last week a couple of you mentioned to me that you remember about the elephants. Today I need a snake, but nobody's got a snake. At least I can't find anyone who has a snake that they would lend me. I thought that'd be rather cool. Truth be told, I don't know if I could do it. Snakes and I don't get along. One of my students once told me that in Africa, the only good snake is a dead snake. But we're not talking about snakes this morning, though I will get to that in a bit. This morning, my purpose is to help us understand and share with you understanding about what's going on in the world around us. Sorry about that. They warned me this might happen. What's going on in the world around us and how that affects us and how that affects our community. I'm a firm believer that sometimes understanding helps us cope. So there's a Psalm 119, verse 34. Give us understanding that we may keep your law and observe it with our whole heart. And that's my purpose this morning, is to talk and share with you some understanding that has come to me and hopefully will help you. So, just so you know, best way to do these things is to tell you what I'm going to say it, and then tell you what I've said. It seems to work most times. So, what I'm going to say is I'm going to talk about the Great Commandment, and then the second one. And then I'm going to talk to you about the third one that doesn't exist, but we've invented it. And then I want to share with you the story of a gentleman who grew up in the United States and was raised an atheist and became a spy and then became a Christian and then wrote a book about communism. And when you read his explanation of what's going on, it helps us understand what's going on in the world around us. And then I will end with an encouragement to be not afraid, but trust in the Lord. So the first part, Matthew chapter 6. No, wrong Matthew. Matthew chapter 22, verse 36. A scholar comes to Jesus and says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your mind, and with all your strength, and with all your soul." And I've messed them up. I got them in a different order. Because that same statement shows up 4 times in the book of Deuteronomy. And it shows up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you go and check them out, you will discover that it's love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. And Mark and Luke add the phrase, with all of your strength. This is the great and first commandment, Jesus said. And then he added, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now, I'd like to make a couple comments about what Jesus just said. Because we don't usually think about the bigger picture. And Dwight was right this morning in wanting to read more. But in Hebrews, if you read more, you're looking at 45 minutes. He was right about that. But what you need to know about this teaching about love the Lord with all of your heart and with all of your mind and with all of your strength and all of your soul always occurs 4 times in Deuteronomy and in the 3 Gospels, always in the same context. And that context is about doing God's teaching. If you're nervous about the word law, just change it to teaching, because that's what it really means. Doing God's teaching. It's not about feeling good. We had a wonderful worship time this morning, and we all felt wonderful, and it resonates with our heart, and this is good. But that's not what loving the Lord is about. I should have been preaching this sermon closer to Valentine's, actually, because we get all fuzzy at Valentine's. But loving the Lord your God is not just about feeling fuzzy. Now, what you need to know is something else. There's a couple figures of speech. And figures of speech are funny things where you say one word and you mean something else. So Adam and Eve are told not to eat the tree. The English translation tries to help you out, but in Hebrew, they're told not to eat the tree. Okay, which in my mind's always made them beavers. But don't eat the tree. There's 2 trees, tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And don't eat the tree. Well, what is a figure of speech called metonymy or synecdoche, where you're naming a part for the whole. So I think Gary Larson's the only one left in this congregation. If you say to him, how many cows do you have? He will say 50, 60, 70 head. So you count the heads instead of the legs and divide by 4. Okay, this is how this figure of speech works. So when you say love the Lord with all your heart, heart is a figure of speech to refer to the whole person. And your heart is everything you are. All of your thoughts, all of your aspirations, all of your hopes, all of your goals, all of your values, and your feelings. But it's all of you. So you could say, love the Lord your God with all of you, with everything you are. And then the second part of the phrase is with all of your soul. And that's your life. Love the Lord your God with all of your life. Give your life, all of you. Again, that same figure of speech where you name a part of you for the whole. And then it comes a third time, love the Lord your God with all of your strength. Okay, everything that holds you together, that allows you to stand. All of your strength. Use all of that in loving the Lord your God. I.e., love the Lord your God with everything you are. And the third time, fourth time, with your mind. Love the Lord your God with your mind. And all of that, to make the point, love the Lord your God. You see, there's 4 different ways, 3 in each gospel, to emphasize the totality of your commitment to the Lord your God. Some other time I would like to explain to you that you need to know which God this is. The Lord your God is the God of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob and David and Isaiah and the God of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is the God. Quit saying to your neighbors, I believe in God. They probably believe in God too. But it's not the God of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob. You need to be more specific. But here the point is, love the Lord your God. So repetition, repetition, more repetition, and repetition again to make the point of how totally committed you are. Now, Romans 12, verse 1 makes the same point. Paul writes, I encourage you, he says to the Romans, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. And there's some fun discussion going on about that, whether they want to present their souls, and he's saying, your bodies too, or whether bodies is to include soul and body. But the point is, all of you, the whole of you. Now, what's this love look like? The easiest place to find this love, to find an illustration of it, is to go back to Genesis. And you can do that. Genesis, start reading. What happens in Genesis? Well, there's an old story about Forrest Gump dying and going to heaven. And he meets Peter and wants to get into heaven. And Peter says, nah, wait a minute. We got a test. Forrest Gump is not crazy about the test. But Peter says, nah, it's okay. It's only one question test. So Forrest Gump says, okay, what's the question? Peter says to Forrest, what's the name of God? How many of you know where this is going? Forrest Gump says, easy. His name is Andy. Peter looks at him and goes, Andy? Yeah. And he walks with me, and he talks with me. And I'm Andy's. Well, walking with God. So if you go back to that Genesis story, Adam and Eve, they're in the garden, and in the evening they hear the presence of God. And God walks with them, and they walk with God. If you read the Psalms, you're always walking with God. That's the big thing, is you walk with God. And if you walk with God, you're going in the same direction God is going. You're sharing the same values of God. You talk to God. This is what love looks like. You talk to God. We might call it prayer. But Adam and Eve talked with God. There was communication, which means they listened to what God had to say. And we listen to what God has to say, most often through our Bibles, through Scripture, but we need to listen. But there's something else about love. I'd almost be tempted to do a survey and find the average age in this congregation to see if how many of you might still remember this when you first fell in love with your spouse, if you have one, or first started to think you were in love with somebody you were hoping was going to become your spouse. And one of the characteristics of that is expectation. You look forward to it. Now, you probably don't think about Adam and Eve like this. God came to them in the evening, in the cool of the evening. But after God being in there with them a few evenings, they would have started to expect and anticipate God coming. Sometimes you stand before God. Sometimes you kneel before God. Sometimes David, in 2 Samuel 7:18, just sat before the Lord. There's only 2 references to that, one in Samuel and the same story in Chronicles. And Brother Ken Balzer preached on this once many years ago. Sitting in the presence of the Lord. We don't think of that very often. But what might that mean? Face to face with God. This is what love looks like. So, what am I trying to say? Love is words. Love is poetry. Love is saying and singing nice things. And even feeling all warm, and I'm going to say fuzzy, not trying to offend anyone. But loving God is more than what happens here Sunday morning. And so if you read 1 John chapter 3, verse 18. Dear children, let us not love just in word and speech, but in deed and truth. You with me so far? Love the Lord your God. I don't know how often we have to say that to each other. I don't know how to say it as more effectively, more emphatically, but love the Lord your God with all of your heart and your life and your strength and your mind. This is what we are called to do. And then Jesus says to this man who came to him and says, and the second commandment is love yourself. No, the second commandment is love your neighbor. And the first thing you want to know, this is always the question. 35 students, 34 want to know, who's my neighbor? Okay? Your neighbor's your neighbor. He's your friend. He's the guy who lives next door to you. He's the guy who lives in the same community. And you are called to love him. Okay? Now, there's a third commandment. No, there's no third commandment. Love yourself is not a commandment. You ever notice that? It's love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say love yourself. Bad news. 2 commandments, not 3. Now, why am I talking about that? Well, I'm a child of the 70s. Oh, yeah, I know that's old. Beyond his shelf life. And if they're coming for me, they're coming for you, brother. I'm an old fart. I lived in the 70s. I was going to university. And all the rage in the 70s was self-love, self-esteem, thinking highly of yourself. And when I started teaching seminary in 1980, I was shocked because I suddenly had a bunch of students who were telling me that I couldn't love my neighbor if I didn't love myself. I couldn't love my neighbor if I didn't love myself. And instinctively, I knew there was something wrong with this. And I hate to tell you, sometimes profs are slow. It took me until about 6 months ago to figure out what was really, really wrong with this. And that's one of the things I want to talk about this morning. Self-love, self-esteem. It was all the rage. The pendulum went way over there. They were dividing the state of California into committees because they thought if they could improve self-esteem, they could deal with drug addiction, homelessness, poverty. It was all because of poor self-esteem. And if you want to read about this and learn more about this, it's delightful reading. Wikipedia. Sorry to tell you, but it's a really good article about the history of this concept of self-esteem and how it took over in the U.S. And then a couple of guys wrote stuff promoting self-esteem, and then people started looking at it and they started doing more work on it. And you know where we're at now? Self-esteem is how we ended up with participation ribbons in grade school. I will never forget the first time I was given a participation ribbon. I was a chubby kid. It was a race. I was 9 out of 10. There was another kid who was chubbier. Okay? And I got a ribbon. And I'm going like, this is weird. Yeah, it is weird, but it was all the rage. You couldn't give kids bad grades. because it would affect their self-esteem, and they had to have self-esteem to perform academically. You know what the most recent conclusions are about self-esteem? This is just absolutely amazing. You can't discipline your children, we were told in the 70s, because that detracted from their self-esteem. The research now, as of 3 years ago, is the kids with the highest self-esteem are the kids that grew up in families with two parents, with rules, with controls, with restrictions, and those are the kids that have the highest self-esteem. So the pendulum went over there, and now it's back over here. The last thing I read on this was high self-esteem is no guarantee that a child will have good grades. Is no guarantee that the child will not partake of drugs. Is no guarantee that the child will avoid early sexual activity. So self-esteem, we've studied it, we know how to evaluate it. It's not what it was cracked up to be. But in the 70s, that became really important and became all of the rage. And every city in California had a committee trying to figure out how to build people's self-esteem, because it was going to solve them all kinds of problems and save them lots of money. And then the research came in and said, doesn't work that way. So all of those committees got shut down. But now we've got associations promoting self-esteem. The commandment is not love yourself. The commandment is love your neighbor. Okay. I'm going to use a metaphor that I'm not sure is going to work anymore. It's a really simple metaphor. It's now time to shift gears. And I'll bet you most of us, you don't even know what that means, because you don't know how to drive a standard transmission. But I'm going to shift gears. And I want to talk to you about where this self-esteem and the likes and stuff like it has gotten us. So now you're living in a world where there seems to be an incredible push towards communism. There's an incredible push towards atheism. Marx and Engels, who started this stuff for us and borrowed it from some Germans. I'm German. This is one of our not good ideas. The love of conflict. If you are paying attention to what's going on in the world, you'd almost say the leaders of our countries are trying to create conflict. And this is all a part of something called deconstruction. It's a very simple idea. If you want to rebuild something, you have to destroy it first. If you want to rebuild something, you have to deconstruct it first. And you know about wokeism, and you know about critical race theory, and you know about drag queen story times. And you've already lived through a long couple decades of assault on marriage and family, and now we're into transgender. And if somebody says something you don't like, you call them a Nazi or a racist. And then we've got BLM, Black Lives Matter, which seems to be trying to destroy us. And LGBTQ. And fear. It's like they're trying to fill our heads with fear. You all recognize this? Nothing new. You know it. Oh, and don't forget climate change. And you know what's really wild about all of this stuff? These things are now being described by people who are evaluating them as new religion. And people are writing books about the old gods coming back. So here's my story about the American. Polish family. He was raised an atheist, born in the United States. His parents were communists, so he became communist. Then he became a spy for Russia. He got a job at the CIA, and he's working as a spy for Russia. And then, praise the Lord for his grace, this gentleman became a Christian. And he quit being a communist, and he quit spying, and fessed it up, and took the penalties. And then he wrote his own biography. And the point of the biography, and this is where I got really interested, was to explain to his children how somebody who was intelligent, well-balanced, normal person could become a communist and stay a communist for decades. You know what his first explanation was? This story is as old as Eve. This story is as old as Eve. And then he went on to explain what he meant by that. And this is what he meant by that. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was more subtle. We don't know whether that refers to how he moved or what he looked like. Could be a reference about colors. Could be a reference about movement. Than any other wild creature that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God say, you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? It's an out-and-out lie. Over-exaggeration. That's not what God said. And the woman said to the serpent, corrected the serpent. She's got things going for her. God didn't say that. He said, you shall not eat of, he said, we may eat of the fruit. Here's that metaphor again. In Hebrew, it's really funny. We may eat the trees, but we put it in English because that strips people's gears. We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but not of that tree, those trees that represent and will give you the knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent said to the woman, oh, God had told them if they eat of that tree, they're going to die. And the serpent says, nah, you won't die. And here's the point. God knows that when you eat of that tree, of the knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, this is the best used car salesman you could possibly imagine. Okay? Sorry if you're a used car salesman. My apologies. I should learn not to say things like that. But here's the simple fact. Here's the simple thing. They were already like God. Read chapter 1. God created human beings, man and woman, in his likeness, in his image. The only difference is that Eve now wanted the one little bit they weren't allowed, and that was the knowledge of good and evil. Why did Eve want that? Well, it goes on to say in verse 6, so when Eve saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate and gave some to her husband, and he ate. Now here's the deal. The tree was to be desired to make one wise. And the gentleman I was telling you about, who was raised a communist and became a spy and then became a Christian, explained to his kids that the reason people become communists, and you all know that in communism there's no room for God. In communism, Marx and Engels saw to it that that whole system is based on conflict between classes and class struggle and people not getting along. And the only way you can manage this kind of revolution is to keep the conflict going. But what was in Eve's mind was the knowledge of good and evil. That makes you wise. And so the gentleman who wrote this book, basically his conclusion is that Eve made her choice because she wanted to be not like God, but be God and do it her way. And Adam went along with it. So don't be blaming Eve for all of this, not just Eve. So Adam and Eve, they made some choices. And those choices we see reflected in our age. And if you go that list I gave you of all the weird stuff you're seeing going on around you, it seems to have started with communism, but now it's gone into everything. And if you look at what's going on, it's just this push and push and push and push to divide people. Because if you can divide them, they're easier to control. You following me? Divide them, they're easier to control. How do you resist? You don't allow yourself to be divided. Cain and Abel. I'm going to give you a little history lesson. So, Dwight wanted to read a few more verses in Hebrews. I want to read most of the Old Testament to you. So if you look at Cain and Abel, Cain had a thing about how God reacted to his sacrifice and ended up killing Abel. Cain then went so far as to say, well, God, if you do this to me and you punish me this way, they're going to kill me. And God says, no, I'll put a mark on your head so they don't kill you. Cain had a great-great-grandson. His name was Lamech. And in chapter 4 of Genesis, Lamech murdered a man. And then he went home and he called his family together and says, wife, children, listen to what I did. I murdered a guy. And then he boasts about it, and he says his boast comes out this way. If Cain was avenged 7 times, I'll be avenged 77 times. So he's proud of this. And then you read the Tower of Babel, and what was their problem? Well, they wanted to be like God too. They wanted to build a tower all the way to heaven. Again, wanting to be God. Sodom and Gomorrah. Don't think sex. Sodom and Gomorrah. There was a guy by the name of Hans Walter Wolf. Have a hint? It's German. He spoke at Heidelberg Seminary. He died in 1993. He spoke on the anniversary Memorial Day in Germany. His text was the Genesis story of Sodom and Gomorrah, chapter 19, verse 1. I've got the text of his message. It's amazing. There isn't one reference in it to homosexuality. That's not what he talked about. What he talked about was the way Sodom and Gomorrah are described in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 16, behold, this was the guilt of Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, and they have an abundance of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. So they were arrogant, proud, haughty, did abominable things before me, God said. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. You see, Sodom and Gomorrah, that's about people who actually convinced themselves that if they could do it, it was right. They had no limitations. And this is the problem we have with where we're at right now, is the whole thing about how communists survive, why it's so popular, how its methodology is to destroy all of the social norms, the family, all of the things that would set us on a moral path, and you destroy and remove all of these things so you can do, frankly, whatever you think is right. And then if you go to Isaiah 14 and the king of Babylon says to himself, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High God. Again, that push to become like God. And if you go and read Ezekiel 28, you'll see a similar statement about the king of Tyre. And this is what happens with people. So as this gentleman's biography pointed out, this whole thing goes all the way back to Eve. So there are 2 commandments, not 3. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor. Go and read 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of stress. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligates, fierce, haters of good, treacherous. It sort of sounds like you're watching the news. Treacherous, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding the form of religion but denying the power of it. Avoid such people. Now, this is ironic, but in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says to his disciples, Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents. That's the irony part. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. He didn't send us out as lions and tigers to fix everything. He's sending us out as sheep in the midst of wolves. John chapter 17, verse 15. Jesus says in his priestly prayer, I do not pray that you should, he's speaking to God, I do not pray that you, God, should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. So my exhortation to you is quit listening to snakes. Okay, that's a bit harsh. You're going to end up meeting snakes. So you're going to end up having to listen to them. But quit with the conversations. And I didn't bring a boa constrictor with me this morning. But I got this little thing here. That's sort of metonymy. It's a stand-in for all of the media you consume. Start paying attention to what you're consuming. Start paying attention to what you're having conversations with, and who's talking to you, and whether you're listening, and maybe loving it a little bit too much. So how do we react in this world we live in to the world around us? I don't know what else to tell you other than to say, be like Jesus. And specifically what I'm thinking about is the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld the glory as of the only Son from the Father. That Son was full of grace and truth. And as you're going through life and you're meeting the snakes, and if you're not meeting the snakes, I'm not sure you're living in the same world I'm living in. And I thought I was living in a pretty remote part of the world I'm living in. But how do you respond? If you read the Gospel of John over and over and over again, Jesus confronts somebody with truth, but he does it very graciously. I'm not telling you to go out and be revolutionaries. I'm telling you to love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Interact with grace and truth. Be prepared to present the truth. Don't be afraid. Worship team, you need to come.